June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. Brest Fortress, Soviet-German border. Private Alexander Fomin jerked awake to a sound he would never forget. The shriek of incoming artillery shells tearing through the pre-dawn darkness. Before his mind could process what was happening, the barracks wall exploded inward, showering him with brick dust and shattered glass. Men screamed. Fire erupted. And in that terrifying instant, as 3 million German soldiers poured across 1,000 miles of Soviet frontier, one question burned through the chaos. How did no one see this coming? But someone did see it coming. 84 times. 84 separate warnings from spies, diplomats, military officers, and intelligence agents had landed on Joseph Stalin's desk in the months before this moment. 84 urgent messages screaming that Adolf Hitler was about to launch the largest military invasion in human history. And 84 times, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union dismissed them, ignored them, or punished the messengers who delivered them. In the next 6 months, 4.7 million Soviet soldiers would be killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies would vanish, cities would burn, and the course of the Second World War, and human history itself, would be forever altered by one man's catastrophic refusal to believe the truth. This is that story, the story of the warnings that were ignored, the spies who risked everything to deliver them, and the millions who paid the ultimate price for one dictator's paranoia. If you find this story as incredible and tragic as I do, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now, let's go back to where this disaster truly began. To understand how Stalin could ignore 84 warnings of an imminent German attack, we need to understand the man himself, and the peculiar blindness that his own paranoia had created. By 1941, Joseph Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for nearly 2 decades. He had survived the chaos of revolution, the brutal civil war, and the treacherous politics of the Communist Party's inner circle. He had done this not through charisma or military genius, but through a cold, calculating ruthlessness and an almost supernatural ability to detect threats, real and imagined, from those around him. Stalin trusted no one. He had risen to power by betraying allies and eliminating rivals. He assumed everyone else operated the same way. This paranoia had kept him alive through years of political intrigue. But in the summer of 1941, it would prove to be his greatest weakness. The relationship between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in the years before the war was complicated, to say the least. On the surface, the two regimes were ideological enemies, fascism versus communism, locked in an existential struggle. Hitler had written extensively about his hatred of Bolshevism and his desire to seize Soviet territory for German expansion. His concept of Lebensraum, living space, explicitly targeted the vast agricultural lands of Ukraine and Western Russia. But in August 1939, the world was shocked when these two bitter enemies signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who negotiated it, was a cynical bargain that allowed both dictators to pursue their immediate goals without interference from the other. Hitler could invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. Stalin could buy time to rebuild his military, which he had devastated through purges, and expand Soviet influence into Eastern Europe. Secret protocols in the pact divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland would be carved up between them. The Baltic states, Finland, and parts of Romania fell into the Soviet sphere. It was a devil's bargain, and both sides knew it wouldn't last forever. But Stalin believed he had more time. He was convinced, absolutely convinced, that Hitler would not risk a two-front war by attacking the Soviet Union while Britain remained undefeated. This belief became the lens through which Stalin interpreted every piece of intelligence that crossed his desk. And this is where the tragedy truly begins. The first warnings started arriving within months of the pact's signing. German military attachés in Moscow began noticing unusual activity. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory increased dramatically. German tourists and businessmen appeared in border regions, asking strange questions about roads, bridges, and military installations. In the summer of 1940, after Germany's lightning conquest of France, the warnings intensified. Soviet intelligence networks in Germany and occupied Europe began picking up disturbing signals. Wehrmacht units were being quietly transferred eastward. New airfields were being constructed in Poland. Supply depots were being established in locations that made no sense, unless you were planning to invade Russia. But what did Stalin do with this information? He dismissed it. Every single report that suggested Germany was preparing to attack was filtered through Stalin's unshakable belief that Hitler would not be so foolish. Any intelligence that contradicted this belief was labeled as British disinformation, an attempt by Churchill to drag the Soviet Union into war with Germany. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. Stalin didn't just ignore the warnings, he actively punished those who delivered them. The Soviet intelligence apparatus in 1941 was actually remarkably effective. The NKVD and GRU, the two main intelligence agencies, had cultivated an impressive network of spies throughout Europe. These agents risked their lives daily to gather information about German intentions, and they were doing their jobs brilliantly. One of the most valuable Soviet assets was a spy network in Germany codenamed the Red Orchestra. These agents had penetrated various levels of German government and military. In the months before the invasion, they sent increasingly urgent warnings about German preparations. The Red Orchestra wasn't just one network. It was a constellation of resistance cells spread across occupied Europe. In Berlin, the network included Arvid Harnack, a senior official in the German economics ministry, and his American-born wife, Mildred. There was Harro Schulze-Boysen, a lieutenant in the Luftwaffe's intelligence department who had access to German Air Force plans. These were not career spies. They were idealists who had watched the Nazis rise to power and made the dangerous decision to resist. The intelligence they gathered was remarkable in its detail. They knew about troop movements, production figures, strategic planning sessions. They risked torture and death with every message they transmitted. And what did they get for their sacrifice? In March 1941, a Red Orchestra agent transmitted a detailed report about Operation Barbarossa, the actual code name for the German invasion plan. The report included the approximate date of the attack, the main axes of advance, and the number of divisions being assembled. It was stunningly accurate. The report specified that 3 army groups would attack simultaneously. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad. Army Group Center would aim for Smolensk and then Moscow. Army Group South would target Ukraine and the Caucasus oil fields. The estimated strength was 180 divisions. The actual invasion would use 190 divisions, following exactly those objectives. Stalin read the report. Then he wrote in the margins, "This information is an English provocation. Find out who is making this provocation and punish them." Those words sealed the fate of millions. But they also reveal something crucial about Stalin's psychology. He wasn't simply ignoring intelligence. He was actively constructing an alternative reality. In Stalin's mind, Britain was desperate to drag the Soviet Union into war with Germany. Every warning, no matter how credible, was reinterpreted as British manipulation. This pattern repeated again and again. Richard Sorge was perhaps the most remarkable spy of the 20th century. A German journalist working in Tokyo, Sorge had secretly been a Soviet agent since the 1920s. He had built an extraordinary network of contacts within the German embassy in Japan, and by 1941 he was providing Moscow with intelligence of extraordinary accuracy. Sorge's story reads like a novel because it's almost too incredible to believe. Born in Russia to a German father and Russian mother, he had fought for Germany in World War I, been wounded multiple times, and then underwent a profound political transformation. He became a communist and was recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1920s. For nearly 2 decades, Sorge lived a double life. On the surface, he was a hard-drinking, womanizing German journalist with impressive Nazi Party connections. He charmed his way into the inner circles of German diplomats wherever he was posted. In reality, he was one of Moscow's most valuable assets, transmitting a steady stream of intelligence that should have shaped Soviet policy. Sorge cultivated a particularly close relationship with the German ambassador to Japan, Eugen Ott. They drank together, played chess together, discussed politics together. Ott trusted Sorge so completely that he shared diplomatic cables and strategic assessments with him. He had no idea that everything he revealed was being transmitted to Moscow. In May 1941, Sorge sent an urgent message to Moscow. He had learned from his contacts that Germany would attack the Soviet Union on June 20th, with 170 to 190 divisions. He provided details about the 3 main army groups and their objectives: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Ukraine in the south. But Sorge went further. He reported the strategic rationale behind the invasion. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union could be defeated in a single campaign lasting 3 to 4 months. The German military had stockpiled supplies for exactly that time frame. No more. There was no plan for a prolonged war. Everything depended on achieving rapid victory before winter. This was crucial intelligence. It revealed not just the when and where of the attack, but the fundamental assumptions underlying German strategy. It suggested that if the Soviet Union could survive the initial onslaught and drag the war into winter, German plans would unravel. The actual invasion came on June 22nd, with 190 divisions, targeting exactly those objectives. Sorge's intelligence was nearly perfect. But when his report reached Stalin, the dictator dismissed it as unreliable. More than that, he specifically ordered that Sorge's network be treated with suspicion. The best spy in the Soviet arsenal was being ignored at the moment his information was most critical. But perhaps the most heartbreaking warning came from within the Soviet military itself. General Philip Golikov was the head of GRU, Soviet military intelligence. In the spring of 1941, his analysts compiled a comprehensive assessment of German intentions. The evidence was overwhelming. Troop movements, logistics preparations, reconnaissance activities, diplomatic signals, everything pointed to an imminent invasion. Golikov knew what he was supposed to conclude. He understood, with the survival instinct of a Soviet official who had witnessed the purges, that Stalin did not want to hear that Germany was about to attack. So Golikov did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He presented the intelligence accurately, then added a conclusion that contradicted his own evidence. His report acknowledged all the signs of German preparations, but concluded that Germany would likely issue an ultimatum before any attack, giving the Soviet Union time to prepare. It was a coward's compromise, designed to tell Stalin what he wanted to hear while technically delivering the intelligence. But Golikov wasn't alone in this moral failure. The entire Soviet system had been warped by Stalin's paranoia. Officers who told the truth disappeared. Those who survived learned to shade their reports, to hedge their conclusions, to give the dictator what he wanted. This created a deadly feedback loop. Stalin didn't believe the warnings, so he punished those who delivered them. Other officials learned to soften their warnings or add caveats that aligned with Stalin's beliefs. This, in turn, reinforced Stalin's conviction that the threat wasn't real. Meanwhile, the evidence continued to mount. In May 1941, a German soldier deserted to the Soviet side near the border. Under interrogation, he revealed that his unit had been ordered to prepare for an attack on the Soviet Union in the coming weeks. He knew approximate dates and objectives. Stalin was informed. His response was to order the man shot as a provocateur. On June 16th, just 6 days before the invasion, the Soviet embassy in Berlin sent an urgent cable. German government offices were preparing to evacuate. Diplomatic staff were burning documents. Ships in German ports had been ordered not to sail for Soviet destinations. Stalin's response? He ordered the Soviet embassy to continue normal operations and avoid any actions that might provoke Germany. The warnings weren't just coming from Soviet intelligence. Britain's codebreakers at Bletchley Park had intercepted German communications, revealing the Barbarossa plans. Churchill himself sent warnings to Stalin. These, too, were dismissed as British attempts to manipulate the Soviet Union into a premature war. American intelligence, which had its own sources in Europe, shared warnings with Soviet diplomats, rejected. The Vatican, through its own diplomatic channels, passed along information about German intentions, ignored. Even neutral nations like Sweden and Switzerland attempted to alert Moscow to the gathering storm. All of it fell on deaf ears. As June 1941 progressed, the signs became impossible to miss for anyone willing to see them. Reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory increased to hundreds per day. German soldiers were seen massing in enormous numbers along the border. The sound of tank engines and artillery being positioned echoed across the frontier. Soviet border guards filed report after report of suspicious activity. On the night of June 21st, another German deserter crossed the border. This was Alfred Liskow, a communist sympathizer in the Wehrmacht who was horrified by what he knew was about to happen. He surrendered to Soviet border guards and told them the invasion would begin in just hours. Liskow was a 24-year-old furniture maker from Bavaria who had been drafted into the German army. He was not a professional soldier or a trained spy, just an ordinary man with a conscience. As his unit took up final positions for the attack, he made an agonizing decision. He would desert, cross into enemy territory, and warn the Soviets about what was coming. Around 9 p.m. on June 21st, Liskow slipped away from his unit and swam across the Bug River. Soviet border guards captured him immediately. Under interrogation, he revealed everything he knew. The attack would begin at 4 a.m. German artillery was already in position. Tanks were fueled and ready. This was not an exercise, it was the real thing. The local commander immediately passed this information up the chain of command. The report reached Moscow around midnight, just hours before the attack. It was added to the pile of warnings on Stalin's desk. At that moment, Stalin was meeting with his inner circle in the Kremlin. They had gathered to discuss the increasingly alarming reports from the border. Some of his advisors urged defensive measures. Surely, with all this evidence, something had to be done. Stalin's response was to order the deserter shot and to forbid any provocative defensive measures along the border. He still believed, that Germany was staging an elaborate bluff, trying to intimidate the Soviet Union into concessions. Any Soviet military response, he feared, would give Hitler the excuse he needed for a genuine attack. This was the logic of a man trapped in his own assumptions. Stalin had convinced himself that war with Germany was inevitable, but not yet. He needed more time to rebuild the military, more time to modernize industry, more time to prepare, and so he clung to the hope that Hitler too would see the wisdom of waiting. Meanwhile, just across the border, 3 million German soldiers waited in silence for the signal to attack. The hours between midnight and dawn on June 22, 1941, were some of the most consequential in modern history. In that brief window, the fate of millions was sealed. Soviet border guards could hear the rumble of engines in the darkness. They could see the massed shapes of tanks and artillery through their binoculars. They filed reports, made phone calls, pleaded for instructions. Nothing came. In Moscow, Politburo members debated what to do. Some urged immediate mobilization. Others, cowed by Stalin's certainty, hesitated. The minutes ticked by. At 3:15 a.m., German artillery opened fire along the entire front. But perhaps the most telling indicator came from German commercial activity. In the days before the invasion, German freight trains loaded with goods crossed into Soviet territory at an increased rate. They were fulfilling trade agreements between the two countries. Meanwhile, trains headed the other way, carrying Soviet grain, oil, and raw materials to Germany, continued to roll. On the very morning of the invasion, a Soviet freight train loaded with supplies for Germany was crossing the border as German artillery opened fire. Stalin was literally supplying his enemy with war materials in the hours before the attack began. The last train crossed at 2 a.m., just over an hour before the bombardment started. Its cargo would help fuel the very tanks that were about to destroy the Soviet armies. Now, let me tell you something that makes this even more infuriating. Stalin wasn't just ignoring warnings, he was actively preventing his military from preparing for the attack. Soviet military doctrine called for troops along the border to be maintained at high readiness. Units were supposed to be dispersed to avoid being caught in concentrated positions by enemy attack. Air defense systems were supposed to be on alert. Ammunition was supposed to be distributed to frontline units. But Stalin forbade all of this. He was so convinced that any defensive preparations would provoke a German attack that he essentially ordered the Soviet military to stand down. Aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip on airfields near the border, perfect targets for German bombers. Ammunition was locked in depots far from the units that would need it. Many frontline divisions were at peacetime strength, with large portions of their troops on leave or engaged in training exercises far from their assigned positions. When nervous commanders requested permission to put their units on alert, they were denied. Some were warned that they would face severe consequences if they took provocative actions. General Dmitry Pavlov commanded the Western Special Military District, the forces directly in the path of the main German attack. In the days before the invasion, Pavlov grew increasingly alarmed. His intelligence officers were reporting massive German concentrations opposite his positions. He requested permission to move his forces into defensive positions. Permission was denied. Stalin ordered Pavlov to avoid any actions that might be perceived as provocative. Pavlov was trapped between two impossible realities. On one hand, he could see the threat massing before him. His own officers were begging him to act. On the other hand, he knew what happened to Soviet generals who disobeyed Stalin's orders. The purges had taught everyone that lesson. So Pavlov obeyed. He kept his forces in peacetime formations. He didn't call up reserves. He didn't move his headquarters to a more defensible location. He followed orders, and in doing so, condemned his command to destruction. On the night of June 21st, Pavlov was at the theater in Minsk, watching a comedy. He had been ordered to maintain a normal schedule to avoid alarming anyone. As he laughed at jokes on stage, 3 German army groups were taking their final positions for the assault on his command. The play that night was The Wedding in Malinovka, a popular Ukrainian musical comedy. The audience laughed at the romantic entanglements and mistaken identities on stage. Pavlov sat in a place of honor, visible to all, proof that nothing unusual was happening, that the situation was under control. Around 2 a.m., an aide slipped into the theater with an urgent message. Reports were coming in from border posts. Something was happening. Pavlov excused himself, drove to his headquarters, and found chaos. Phone lines to forward units were dead. Radio communications were jammed. Explosions could be heard in the distance. By dawn, Pavlov's world had collapsed. His air force had been destroyed on the ground. His forward divisions were surrounded. His communications were shattered. The largest military operation in history was rolling over his command, and there was almost nothing he could do to stop it. When the attack came at 3:15 a.m. on June 22nd, 1941, it was exactly as devastating as the warnings had predicted, and worse. The German offensive, Operation Barbarossa, was the largest military operation in human history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by another million troops from allied nations, attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They were backed by 3,600 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, and 7,000 artillery pieces. Facing them were Soviet forces that had been deliberately kept unprepared. The Luftwaffe struck first, hitting Soviet airfields while most planes were still on the ground. In the first hours of the attack, the Soviet Air Force lost over 1,200 aircraft, 800 of them destroyed before they could even take off. By the end of the first day, German air superiority was complete. Think about what that means. 800 aircraft, each one representing months of industrial production, years of pilot training, and millions of rubles invested, destroyed in their parking spots. Pilots ran to their planes only to find them already burning. Others managed to get airborne, only to find themselves hopelessly outnumbered by German fighters already controlling the skies. Some Soviet pilots fought with suicidal bravery. When they ran out of ammunition, they rammed German aircraft. When their planes were crippled, they aimed for enemy columns on the ground. But individual heroism couldn't compensate for systemic failure. Why were the planes parked in neat rows, wingtip to wingtip, making such perfect targets? Because Stalin had forbidden dispersal as a provocative measure. Why weren't pilots in their cockpits ready to scramble? Because standing alerts had been canceled to avoid provocation. Why did air defense systems fail to engage? Because commanders were waiting for authorization that never came. The destruction of Soviet air power in the first hours of the war had consequences that rippled through the entire campaign. Without air cover, Soviet ground forces were mercilessly attacked from above. German dive bombers turned supply convoys into burning wreckage. Panzer columns advanced under an umbrella of air support that made them virtually unstoppable. On the ground, the situation was equally catastrophic. German armored units smashed through Soviet defensive lines that hadn't been properly manned or prepared. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed in the first days of fighting. Communication systems collapsed. Commanders lost contact with their units. Orders, when they came at all, were contradictory and impossible to execute. Remember Private Alexander Fomin from the opening of the story? He was at Brest Fortress, one of the first points hit by the German attack. The fortress was supposed to be a key defensive position guarding the border. Instead, it became a death trap. The garrison at Brest had received no warning of the attack. Many soldiers were asleep when the first shells fell. Ammunition was locked in armories that were destroyed in the initial bombardment. Communications were severed immediately. Units were scattered and confused. The fortress itself was an old 19th century fortification, a sprawling complex of walls, barracks, and bunkers, built where the Bug and Mukavets rivers meet. Before the war, it had housed several thousand Soviet soldiers and their families. On the morning of June 22nd, it became a killing ground. German artillery zeroed in on the fortress with devastating precision. Buildings collapsed, fires spread, water mains burst, flooding some areas while leaving others without drinking water. The wounded screamed for help that wouldn't come. And yet, the defenders of Brest Fortress fought back with incredible courage. Without orders, without supplies, without any hope of relief, Soviet soldiers held portions of the fortress for over a month. The last defenders were still fighting in late July, surrounded by a German army that had already advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Commissar Yefim Fomin, no relation to Alexander but sharing that common name, emerged as one of the leaders of the resistance. He organized scattered soldiers into fighting units, distributed what ammunition could be found, and inspired defenders to hold on against impossible odds. When he was finally captured, the Germans executed him immediately. His body, riddled with bullets, was dumped in a ditch near the fortress walls. Others held out even longer. Major Pyotr Gavrilov continued fighting until July 23rd, more than a month after the invasion began. He was captured only after being seriously wounded and losing consciousness. The Germans were so impressed by his resistance that they gave him medical treatment and took photographs of the gaunt, bearded officer who had defied them for so long. On the walls of the fortress, defenders carved messages that have haunted historians ever since. "I am dying, but I do not surrender. Farewell, motherland. We were 3. It was hard, but we did not lose heart." These words, scratched into brick with bayonets and knives, remain visible today. The heroism at Brest was repeated at countless locations along the front. Individual soldiers and small units fought with desperate bravery against overwhelming odds, but bravery couldn't compensate for the catastrophic failures of leadership that had left them so vulnerable. In the first weeks of the war, the scale of the Soviet disaster became clear. The Western Front, General Pavlov's command, essentially ceased to exist. Of the 4 armies under his control, 3 were destroyed in the first week. Over 400,000 soldiers were killed or captured in the Białystok and Minsk encirclements alone. Pavlov himself would later be arrested, subjected to a show trial, and executed. His crime, according to the verdict, was cowardice and failure to execute orders. In reality, he was being punished for a disaster that Stalin's own policies had made inevitable. The Białystok pocket was a nightmare of encirclement and destruction. German pincers closed behind 3 Soviet armies, trapping nearly 300,000 men in a shrinking pocket with no hope of escape. Soldiers fought until they ran out of ammunition, then fought with bayonets and bare hands. The wounded were abandoned as units tried desperately to break through German lines. By July 9th, it was over. The Germans counted 290,000 prisoners, 2,585 tanks destroyed or captured, 1,449 artillery pieces taken. The numbers were so staggering that German commanders initially refused to believe them. They checked and rechecked the tallies, unable to comprehend the scale of their victory. But the Białystok catastrophe was just the beginning. At Minsk, another 300,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled and destroyed. At Smolensk in August, another massive encirclement added to the toll. At Kiev in September, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the largest encirclement in military history. Each of these disasters had the same pattern. Soviet forces, positioned according to peacetime plans that had never been updated, were overwhelmed by German mobile warfare. Commanders hesitated to retreat without authorization from Moscow, and authorization rarely came. By the time permission was granted, it was too late. The German pincers had already closed. Pavlov's execution sent a chilling message through the Soviet military. If a general could be shot for following Stalin's own orders, no one was safe. This created a vicious cycle of fear that made effective military decision-making almost impossible. But here's what makes this tragedy even more heartbreaking. While millions of Soviet soldiers were dying on the front lines, Stalin himself disappeared. For the first crucial days of the invasion, the Soviet dictator was essentially paralyzed. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow and refused to make decisions or even communicate with his commanders. When Politburo members finally tracked him down, they found him despondent, apparently convinced they had come to arrest him. "Lenin founded our state," Stalin reportedly said, "and we've screwed it up." For nearly 2 weeks, as the German army advanced hundreds of miles and destroyed army after army, the Soviet Union functionally had no leader. Decisions that needed to be made at the highest level went unmade. Resources that needed to be allocated sat idle. A counterattack that might have slowed the German advance was never organized. Some historians believe Stalin suffered a genuine nervous breakdown. Others think he was testing his subordinates, waiting to see if they would try to remove him from power. Whatever the reason, his absence in those critical first days made an already catastrophic situation even worse. When Stalin finally emerged from his paralysis and addressed the Soviet people on July the 3rd, 11 days after the invasion began, the Germans had already advanced 300 miles into Soviet territory. They had captured or destroyed thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The cities of Minsk, Vilnius, and Riga had fallen. Leningrad was threatened. The road to Moscow seemed open. Now, I want you to think about those numbers for a moment, because they represent human beings. 4.7 million Soviet military casualties in the first 6 months of the war. That's not just a statistic. It's 4.7 million individual tragedies. Sons who never came home. Fathers who never saw their children grow up. Young men who had their entire futures stolen from them. And so many of those deaths were preventable. If Stalin had heeded even a fraction of the warnings he received, the Soviet Union could have been prepared. Troops could have been positioned in defensive formations. Aircraft could have been dispersed and protected. Ammunition could have been distributed. Reserves could have been mobilized. Would the Germans still have attacked? Almost certainly. Hitler was committed to the destruction of the Soviet Union, but a prepared Soviet military could have made the German advance far more costly. The catastrophic encirclements that destroyed entire armies might have been avoided. The loss of thousands of aircraft on the first day might never have happened. How many of those 4.7 million casualties might have survived if their leader had trusted his own intelligence services? We'll never know the exact number, but we know it would have been substantial. There's a cruel irony at the heart of this story. Stalin's paranoia, his pathological distrust of everyone around him, was supposed to protect him. It had protected him through decades of political intrigue. It had helped him survive the purges that he himself had orchestrated. But when it came to Hitler, Stalin's paranoia betrayed him. Stalin couldn't believe that Hitler would attack because he couldn't imagine that Hitler would be foolish enough to open a two-front war. He projected his own calculating rationality onto the Nazi dictator. He assumed Hitler would wait until Britain was defeated before turning east. But Hitler wasn't rational, not in the way Stalin understood rationality. Hitler was driven by ideology and racial hatred that transcended military logic. He had written in Mein Kampf about his determination to destroy Jewish Bolshevism and seize Soviet territory for German colonization. These weren't diplomatic positions to be negotiated. They were core beliefs that defined Hitler's worldview. Stalin, the great cynic, couldn't comprehend true ideological fanaticism. He thought Hitler was playing the same game he was, buying time, maneuvering for advantage, waiting for the right moment. He couldn't fathom that Hitler actually meant what he said. There's another factor that historians have debated for decades: Stalin's purges of the Soviet military in the late 1930s. In 1937 and 1938, Stalin had executed or imprisoned a staggering number of senior military officers. 3 of 5 marshals were killed. 13 of 15 army commanders were killed. 50 of 57 corps commanders were killed. 154 of 186 division commanders were killed. Thousands of experienced officers at every level were eliminated. The purges destroyed the institutional knowledge of the Soviet military. Experienced commanders were replaced by political loyalists who often lacked military competence. Officers who survived learned to keep their heads down, avoid initiative, and tell their superiors what they wanted to hear. This culture of fear contributed directly to the failure to prepare for Barbarossa. Officers who might have insisted on defensive preparations were too afraid to contradict Stalin's belief that Germany wouldn't attack. Those who delivered unwelcome intelligence risked their careers and their lives. The Red Army that faced the German onslaught in June 1941 was not just unprepared materially. It was crippled psychologically by years of terror. Yet despite all of this, the ignored warnings, the unprepared defenses, the leadership paralysis, the Soviet Union survived. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. The Soviet system that Stalin had built was brutal and inefficient in many ways, but it had one crucial advantage: sheer size. The Soviet Union was simply too big, too populous, and too industrialized to be conquered in a single campaign. The Germans had planned to defeat the Soviet Union in 3 to 4 months. Instead, they found themselves fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that kept producing more soldiers, more tanks, more aircraft. The ruthless mobilization of Soviet society, forced labor, relocated factories, total commitment of resources, eventually turned the tide. In the first weeks of the war, entire industrial complexes were dismantled and shipped eastward by train. Factories in Ukraine and Western Russia were loaded onto flat cars and transported to the Urals and Siberia, beyond the reach of German bombers. Workers followed their machines, sometimes continuing production even before new factory buildings were completed, assembling tanks in the open air in sub-zero temperatures. The human cost of this mobilization was staggering. Women, children, and elderly men worked 12-hour shifts to replace soldiers sent to the front. Food was rationed to starvation levels. Cities without strategic importance received almost nothing, their populations left to survive as best they could. But it worked. By the end of 1941, Soviet factories were outproducing German factories in tanks and aircraft. The Red Army, nearly destroyed in the summer, was rebuilding with fresh divisions from Siberia and Central Asia. By the end of 1941, the German advance had stalled outside Moscow. The following year brought the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad. And by 1945, it was Soviet tanks rolling into Berlin, not German tanks in Moscow. The Battle of Moscow in December 1941 marked the first major German defeat. The fresh Siberian divisions, transferred west based partly on Sorge's intelligence that Japan would not attack, slammed into exhausted German forces that had been fighting since June. For the first time, the Wehrmacht was thrown back. Stalingrad, in the winter of 1942-43, was even more decisive. An entire German army, over 300,000 men, was encircled and destroyed. It was the largest defeat in German military history, and it marked the turning point of the war in Europe. But the cost of that victory was staggering. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people during the war, both military and civilian. It remains the deadliest conflict in human history for any single nation. How many of those deaths can be attributed to Stalin's refusal to heed the warnings? It's impossible to calculate precisely. But the initial catastrophe, the destruction of the Soviet Air Force, the encirclement of entire armies, the loss of vast territories, set the stage for the long, bloody road to victory. Every death in those first chaotic weeks was a direct consequence of Stalin's willful blindness. Let me tell you about some of the people who tried to warn Stalin and what happened to them. Richard Sorge, the master spy in Tokyo who provided such accurate intelligence about the invasion, continued his work throughout 1941. In October of that year, he sent another crucial piece of intelligence. Japan had decided to strike south against British and American possessions, rather than attack the Soviet Union from the east. This information was vital. It allowed Stalin to transfer Siberian reserve divisions to defend Moscow in the critical winter of 1941-42. These fresh troops played a crucial role in stopping the German advance. But Sorge's luck ran out. Japanese counterintelligence eventually identified him as a Soviet agent. He was arrested in October 1941. The same month he sent his report about Japanese intentions. After years of imprisonment and failed Soviet attempts to negotiate his release, Sorge was executed in Tokyo in November 1944. The Soviet Union never officially acknowledged Sorge's contributions during his lifetime. It wasn't until 1964, 20 years after his death, that he was posthumously named a hero of the Soviet Union. What about the domestic intelligence officers who had tried to warn Stalin? Many suffered terribly. Some were punished for delivering unwelcome news before the invasion. Others were blamed for intelligence failures afterward, a bitter irony given that their intelligence had been accurate but ignored. The members of the Red Orchestra faced the cruelest fate of all. Arvid Harnack and his wife Mildred, Haro Schulze-Boysen and his wife Libertas, all were eventually caught by the Gestapo. German counterintelligence had been tracking radio transmissions and slowly piecing together the network. The arrests began in August 1942, more than a year after the intelligence they'd gathered could have saved millions of lives. Under torture, some members revealed others. The network unraveled. Over 100 people were arrested across Germany and occupied Europe. The executions began in December 1942. Arvid Harnack was hanged at Plötzensee prison in Berlin. His wife Mildred, an American-born literature professor who had translated works to help the resistance, was beheaded 3 months later, the only American woman executed by the Nazis. Haro Schulze-Boysen, the Luftwaffe officer who had risked everything to warn of the coming invasion, was hanged alongside his wife Libertas. They were both 33 years old. These people had seen the truth and tried to share it. They had risked everything, and ultimately given everything, to warn of a catastrophe that could have been prevented. Their intelligence reports had crossed Stalin's desk and been dismissed as provocation. Did Stalin ever acknowledge their sacrifice? Never. The Soviet government showed no interest in securing their release or even acknowledging their existence. They died alone, betrayed by the very regime they had tried to save. The culture of fear that had prevented effective warning continued throughout the war. Officers remained reluctant to deliver bad news to superiors. Information was filtered and distorted as it moved up the chain of command. Stalin's paranoia, having caused the initial catastrophe, continued to hamper Soviet military operations for years. The 84 warnings have become legendary in intelligence history. They represent one of the greatest failures of intelligence, not in collection, but in analysis and action. The information was there. The spies had done their jobs. But at the highest level, ideology and paranoia prevented the truth from being heard. Intelligence professionals today study Barbarossa as a cautionary tale. It demonstrates that even the best intelligence is worthless if decision-makers refuse to believe it. It shows how cognitive biases, the tendency to interpret information in ways that confirm existing beliefs, can lead to catastrophic consequences. Stalin wanted to believe that Hitler wouldn't attack, so every piece of intelligence suggesting otherwise was rationalized away, dismissed as disinformation, or attributed to foreign manipulation. This is called confirmation bias, and it's a trap that ensnares leaders and ordinary people alike. We see echoes of this failure throughout history: Pearl Harbor, the Yom Kippur War, the 9/11 attacks. In each case, there were warnings. In each case, those warnings were missed, dismissed, or not properly acted upon. The specific circumstances differ, but the underlying pattern remains. We believe what we want to believe, and we find ways to explain away evidence that contradicts our beliefs. There's a final chapter to this story that I want to share with you. After the war, Stalin rewrote history. The official Soviet narrative portrayed him as the wise leader who had prepared the nation for war and led it to victory. The catastrophic failures of June 1941 were blamed on treasonous generals, incompetent subordinates, and the overwhelming strength of the German attack. The 84 warnings were buried in classified archives. The intelligence officers who had delivered them were not celebrated. The truth of Stalin's responsibility for the disaster was suppressed. It wasn't until after Stalin's death in 1953 that some acknowledgement of the failures began to emerge. Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 touched on Stalin's mistakes before the war, though it stopped well short of full accountability. Subsequent decades brought more revelations as archives were opened and survivors shared their stories. Today, we have a clearer picture of what happened in those crucial months of 1941. We can read the intelligence reports that Stalin dismissed. We can trace the warnings as they traveled up the chain of command, only to be ignored or explained away. We can see, with terrible clarity, the price of one man's refusal to confront uncomfortable truths. But understanding the past doesn't undo its consequences. Those 4.7 million Soviet soldiers who fell in the first 6 months of the war, they don't come back. The families torn apart, the communities devastated, the potential futures that were never realized. None of that can be recovered. What we can do is learn from it. The story of the 84 warnings is, at its heart, a story about the importance of truth. It shows what happens when leaders surround themselves with yes men who tell them what they want to hear. It demonstrates the danger of dismissing information that contradicts our assumptions. It reveals how fear and paranoia, even when intended as protection, can blind us to real threats. These lessons apply far beyond intelligence analysis or military strategy. They're relevant to businesses, to governments, to organizations of all kinds, and to individuals making decisions in their own lives. Are you ignoring warnings? Are there uncomfortable truths that you're explaining away because they don't fit your preferred narrative? Are the people around you afraid to tell you what you need to hear? Stalin thought his paranoia protected him. Instead, it created a bubble of false information that nearly cost him everything. The soldiers at Brest Fortress didn't have the luxury of self-deception. When the shells started falling, they had to face reality whether they wanted to or not. They fought with incredible courage against impossible odds, and many of them died because their leader had refused to listen. We owe it to them and to all those who suffered because warnings went unheeded, to learn from their sacrifice, to value truth over comfort, to listen to the intelligence, even when it tells us things we don't want to hear. June 22nd, 1941, remains one of the most consequential dates in human history. On that morning, as the sun rose over a 1,000-mile front, 3 million German soldiers began an invasion that would reshape the world. They advanced into a Soviet Union that had been warned again and again that this day was coming. 84 times, the truth had knocked on Stalin's door. 84 times, he refused to answer. 4.7 million Soviet soldiers paid the price. And the echoes of that failure still resonate today, reminding us that the most dangerous lies are often the ones we tell ourselves. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths, please share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's most consequential moments. Because the past has so much to teach us, if only we're willing to listen.